Hi, okay, welcome to lesson 7, Between the Testaments. And now we're actually between the Testaments. So for some time now, we've been looking at what secular history, but also history that is recorded in the Old Testament. But we've left that time period now, and we're beyond the time that is recorded with any history at all through the biblical text. And we're going to talk now about the empire that Nebuchadnezzar knew of and dreamed of, that comes into play after the Persians. And that would be, of course, the Greek Empire. It's kind of interesting the way the Greek Empire really comes about. And you cannot really study this without considering the two kings for Macedonia, Philip and his son Alexander, who, of course, is Alexander the Great. And so it's hard to talk about between the Testament history without understanding the influence that these two men, particularly Alexander, had on the Jews that we see still within the New Testament passages and scriptures. Artaxerxes I dies in 424 BC. He was the Persian king there that we talked about, that Nehemiah was in the palace of, and Esther was more than likely, or quite possibly anyway, alive during the reign of Artaxerxes I. He dies, and Persia begins to weaken. And though Persia continues to have minor successes, and they still kind of have some military play in the world, they don't, none of that changes the pattern of history, which was foretold, of course, in the image of that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. So in 338 BC, Philip, who was a Macedon, he interprets this alliance that Athens makes with Persia as sort of an unfriendly gesture towards Macedonia. If you're able to see the slides, you can see that Macedonia is this little bitty place. And of course, we know of Macedonia. It has grown a little bit from the time of the missionary journeys. But Macedonia is at that time just this little bitty sort of landlocked little area that Philip is the king of. So Philip and his son Alexander were energetic. They were dominant personalities. They sort of were on the scene of this new world that was opening up west of where the Persian Empire had spread to. And Philip of Macedon is worried about this alliance that Athens, of course, Greece, has made with Persia. And then at the death of Darius II, the empire founded by Cyrus the Great really comes to an end. And that's about 330 BC. And so we're beginning to see changes on the front of the world. Greece is the new world power, really. And a real union of the Greek states was achieved really by this Philip of Macedonia, who, strictly speaking, was not a Greek at all. He was not really, he didn't have any Greek blood, really. But Philip was the father of Alexander, and he was murdered in 336 BC, and his kingship and his rulership goes to his young son, Alexander. Alexander was Macedonian by nationality, but Alexander was even more Greek than his father thought himself to be. Alexander really actually dreamed of national glory there in Macedonia, but he actually saw himself more culturally aligned with the Greek culture. He was actually educated by Aristotle. Of course, he was privileged, growing up as Philip's son, and had had the best education in the world at that time, which of course was Greek. And so that's who he was, and that's sort of what molded his youth. He was thoroughly sold on the excellencies of this Greek way of life. And the Greeks were tremendously wonderful at life, culturally speaking. And he gave support to this lifestyle of the Greeks, so the Greeks gave him little support for conquering, or actually even really, they didn't really take notice of him until a little bit later on. He carried the Iliad and the Odyssey with him on his campaigns. He also, it was interesting, though his army, he had a small army of Macedonians, but he carried with him historians. He had geographers, so he people that knew the map, knew the globe, knew the territory and the lands very well. Of course, he, as we know through history, and most of us know of Alexander the Great's expeditions and his conquering, and so quite well known. He took botanists with him who knew of the foliage and the plant sources within the territories that he wanted to take over. He was quite an interesting conqueror. He goes across the Dardanelles, which is that area that Xerxes had built that bridge and spanked the waters there. That is still the present day strait there between the continent of Europe and the continent of Asia. It still is. So if you go to Istanbul, as if you've ever traveled to Istanbul, you know that that is where that divide is, to where when you just go across that bridge, you go from Europe to Asia and vice versa. So he crosses there by boat at this very spot that Xerxes had built this bridge and prepared the bridge to cross when he was going over. He was also fixated on the Greeks. And he goes across, and Darius III of Persia, who's now in play there in Susa, he's not really interested in Alexander. He's not really the Persian Empire has been great for so many years at this point that he's not really concerned about this young king from Macedonia. And so he doesn't really take the expedition seriously, this expedition that Alexander's on. He orders that Alexander, he orders his armies to go and take Alexander and to bring Alexander back to Susa. Go get him and bring him back to me. Well, of course, they meet him there at Granicus there. If you can see the map on the slide, it's that far western point there of what is the continent of Asia, right as Alexander crosses there, the Dardanelles, and he is there, and he has this great battle. And Alexander meets those forces that have come from Susa, from the capital of the Persian Empire, and he defeats them barely. He barely defeats them, but he defeats them. And then really Asia Minor just kind of spread out before him. And he is going to take then that territory across Asia Minor, and his sights are set. And so the map is a little bit bigger now on the screen, and you can see these are kind of the conquest of Alexander the Great as he makes his way across the continent of Asia Minor and Asia. He is considered a liberator by many people in Asia. Actually, Babylon welcomes him, much as they did, if you recall, Cyrus. Remember, they were excited that Cyrus had come in and taken them. They were not fans of Belshazzar. In fact, the priest of Marduk, who were the ones who also favored Cyrus, also favor Alexander, and Alexander rebuilds the temple that Xerxes had destroyed there in Babylon. And so he finds favor as he conquers the lands. 20 days after he enters Babylon, he will take Susa, which is the capital of Persia. And of course, then the cards just fall for Persia, and the Greeks really do take over. He plunders Susa, and then he goes and proceeds to the richest city in the world at that time, which is Persepolis. And Persepolis he takes, he burns it, he kills all the men, he takes the women as slaves, and he really does begin then to just, the whole empire at that point opens up for him. The whole Persian Empire opens up for him. And so he really becomes a leader in a short amount of time. He is very young at this point, in his early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. He marries a woman named Bactria. She is from the northwest part of India, really in the what is now presently kind of Afghanistan area. Her name was Roxana. He dies at the age of 33. And Roxana gives birth shortly after to their son, their only son, his only offspring, who will be murdered then by Cassandra, who was one of Alexander's successors before the child ever reaches maturity. In Alexander's short life, he conquered more territory than any of his predecessors had ever conquered. And Alexander did not live long enough to mold the government of his empire, but the 11 years after he crossed the Dardanelles until his death really changed the course of history for everyone. Hellenism was successfully spread by Alexander, by this young man, throughout the world, throughout the known empires of the world, which would become, of course, largely the Greek Empire. So it is important for us to understand this influence, when this influence happened. We're now 300 years before Jesus is born. And Hellenism is well on the rise. It will be deeply embedded in the cultures of the world. Even within Palestine, the Palestinian Jews who live in Judea and Galilee will be influenced. They would all speak Greek. That may not be their first tongue, but they would have had a lot of this influence. And this young man, Alexander the Great, is the reason for that. This is a quote again. I read this in the last class, but I think it's interesting. I think it's important for us to continue to remember this as we go throughout this. This is Charles Pfeiffer in the Between the Testaments text that he wrote. At no time after the Babylonian exile did the majority of the Jews live in Palestine. Many remained in their settlements in Babylon or settled in other parts of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Others went to Syria, where there were large Jewish settlements, particularly in Antioch and Damascus. Asia Minor had large Jewish communities. The account of the visitors in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in Acts, the 2nd chapter, and the journeys of the Apostle Paul give us a significant picture of the settlements of the Jews of the dispersion. These Jews remained loyal to the Jerusalem temple. Every male Israelite over the age of 20 was expected to pay his temple dues. The pilgrimages were made whenever the Jews of Babylon would not have the same attitude. However, the Jews of Babylon would not have the same attitude of those in Egypt. Those in Palestine would be apt to consider themselves alone the truly Orthodox. And so we begin to see these divisions of the Orthodox Jews. We're going to talk in one of the later classes of the way that the Pharisees and the Sadducees sort of took birth during this time. But it's interesting for us to remember that never again, after the Israelites were taken into captivity in Babylon, would the principles of being sojourners, of living in the world and not of the world, have not been clear to them. As we as Christians understand that we are not first Americans, we are first Christians. We are citizens of a greater kingdom. You Christians who might be listening to this in India are not first Indians, but you are first Christians, part of a kingdom that your sisters in Seychelles and your sisters in Germany and your sisters in America are all part of, and in Mexico and all over the world. And so these are principles that we begin to see between the testaments, particularly after the influence of the dispersion. Alexander the Great had been a missionary as well as a conqueror. From his teacher Aristotle, he had been taught the virtues of Greek philosophy and of the Greek way of life. Alexander had attempted to establish a model Hellenistic community in each of the lands that he had conquered. Alexander in Alexandria in Egypt, which was, of course, is that huge city there in the northern part of Egypt, is the best known and most successful of these plans of communities. Alexander was sure that the excellencies which these communities represented would have an effect on making Hellenism attractive to the countries in which they were located, and it certainly did. And so Hellenism, when we read about it in the scriptures, and I have a couple of the biblical texts that refer to Hellenism, this certainly does not exhaust Hellenism being addressed in the New Testament. But when we think about this, it is a culture as well as a language and a way of life. The ancient or modern name for the country of Greece is Hellas or Hellendia, and that is where Hellenism comes from. After the death of Alexander, many city-states came under the Greek influence and they were Hellenized. The Hellenists, therefore, were not necessarily ethnic Greeks as we know them today. They were Egyptians, they were Jews, they were Arabs, they were Armenians, among others. Hellenization reached to the entire span of the Grecian Empire after the days of Alexander. And so these are just a couple of the passages in Acts, the 6th chapter. Remember when there was a problem of some of the widows being neglected. They happened to be Hellenist widows, which just means culturally. They were from areas of the world. They had traveled from areas of the world where Greek was their mother tongue. They spoke and culturally acted in those Grecian ways. That didn't mean they didn't keep the law of the Old Testament, of the Mosaic law, but culturally they were a different people. And they were being neglected. And we see that passage in Acts, the 6th chapter, and Acts the 9th chapter, when Paul, or formerly Saul, returns back. And he comes in contact with those who probably were part of that synagogue of the freedmen, which was that's who he was. Actually, that's who he was. That's why he was both a Roman citizen, considered himself a Roman citizen. He was part of that activity, and he spoke boldly in the name of the Lord and disputed against the Hellenists, those who would have had Hellenist views or been influenced by this culture. And so we begin to see this happening in the world, and you can see on the map where Rome is, where Greece is, where Macedonia is, where Judea is. And all of these areas were highly influenced after Alexander the Great by this culture. So about 100 years after the Jews have returned to Jerusalem from exile, Alexander the Great sweeps through Judea in his massive conquering campaign. By the way, he comes through Jerusalem. There are all kinds of stories that he sacrificed, but he had heard all of his life about the Jews of Jerusalem, and he had sacrificed on the altar. His empire became known as the Greek or the Hellenian Empire. It extends from all the way from Greece to Egypt to India, and the influence of Hellenism will now continue into the 1st century, and the Romans will take control in 63 BC, 63 years before Jesus is born, and 63 years before the New Testament opens up to us. So the Greek Empire is a strong empire. It lasts for many years, as we saw on our charts initially. But I will tell you, this influence is great, and it can be seen, and the residues of it can be seen in the New Testament as we begin to study the harmony of the Gospels. All the Jews throughout the world were influenced by the Greek culture. The Greek language was known, as well as their native Aramaic. The Jewish leadership was challenged. The high priesthood was replaced. The Sadducee-controlled Sanhedrin began to be the lawkeepers, following the laws of the land more closely than they did the laws of Moses. And so you begin to see the shift that the Greek Empire is now invested in the land of Palestine. The Hebrew names were replaced by Greek names. We see that as the men are chosen, those men that were chosen in Acts the 6th chapter to take care of those Grecian widows, those 7 men, they were names that were Greek names, Philip and Stephen being among those. And if you'll remember, Saul is a Hebrew name for this zealous and righteous Jew who is killing Christians. For the apostle who takes the gospel to the Gentile, his name is Paul, which is a Greek name meaning little fellow. And so you begin to see the influences and the changes, even among the Jewish people during these years, all happening between the Testaments. Hellenistic cities could be easily identified. They could be easily seen. Fine public buildings were erected. Gymnasiums were built for the culture of those who loved the body. Of course, this is the Olympic origins. The Greeks always stressed physical fitness and the beauty of the body. There were open air theaters which were built to entertain the population. Greek dress was observed in every city. The Greek language was spoken. Greek school of thought or philosophy became very apparent, and city governments were aligned with all aspects of Greek governments. And of course, those Jews during these years began to adjust themselves then to this way of life. And so we see that Palestine will be subject and they will successfully be affected by the Egyptian Ptolemies in the years to come. We will see the Seleucids come in and they will have tremendous influence. In fact, that's what will lead to the wars of the Maccabees. But it was these Hellenists that would have such a major impression. All of them would also be affected by the Hellenism that Alexander the Great has emphasized in his 11 years of taking over really the world. And while they had military rivals, they were military rivals with the Greeks, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. They were culturally immersed in the ways of the Greek because it was a nice way of life. Hellenist centers such as Alexandria in Egypt and Pergamum and Dura become centers of cultural activities. And these influences then, of course, trickle down and they affect the Jews. And while not all was bad, not all was good. And Hellenism would present challenges for the Jews and Judaism and the Jews of the dispersion and also the ones in Palestine. Norman Bentwich states, the interaction of Judaism and Hellenistic culture is one of the fundamental struggles in the march of civilization. If the great temptation to pre-exile Israel was idolatry of its Canaanite neighbors, that was really the great temptation of pre-exile Israel. The great temptation of post-exile Judaism was Hellenistic attitudes towards life. And you begin to see those philosophies creeping in. They're discussed in the New Testament, the Stoics, the Gnostics. Stoicism was taught that it was the best way, it was the best way to live was to understand nature, to be true with it, reacting to it organically instead of fighting against the natural impulses and natural things that were naturally embedded in the earth and the things that the flesh naturally reacted to. And of course, the Jewish belief in one God was completely foreign to the Greeks. They were fairly accepting of other religions. The Greeks were okay with other religions. You remember when Paul comes to Athens, they're fairly curious. They have a statue to the unknown God in case they had missed anybody. But this obstinance that the Jews had, that when they held so firmly to the fact that they would worship no one but one God, that it was only one God, and it was the God of the Jews, and he was the only right God, and he was the only righteous God, and he was the only one that was worthy of praise, that really, really rubbed them the wrong way. And of course, it's what would lead to the Maccabean revolts, which we'll talk about in this Between the Testaments series prior to Jesus's birth. And so it is interesting to think about these things as we go through, because these are things that will begin to be things that are the Jewish leaders will have to deal with for many years. Gnosticism, one of the most dangerous influence, and we see this influence even within the churches, was to the Jews and later to the Christians, a real threat. And it was something that concerned Greeks' beliefs about the physical and the spiritual realms. The earth was created not by the Most High God, but by an underling, several levels below, who possessed physical form and of his creation, and he was imperfect. You know, the one thing about the Greek and then the Roman gods, who adapted many of the Greek gods and gave them other names, but their attributes were fairly similar. They held fleshly forms, but they all had a weakness. There was always a weakness, Achilles' heel or Cupid. That they had weaknesses. And so the idea of Jesus Christ, who was fully man and fully God, just flew against the Gnosticism that was deeply embedded in the Hellenistic approaches to life. Jesus could only appear to be physical, or he could not be the Son of God. And so if the physical is evil, then there's no resurrection from the dead. Instead, salvation would be uniting with the high God. And so those are all things that Gnosticism held and played into Between the Testaments. Allegory was something that was adapted, this Alexandrian allegory. It's an expression that, of course, we talk about this expression by means of symbolic, fictional figures, actions of truth, generalizations about human existence. And of course, a lot of people today do this without unknowingly, that the ark wasn't, really that the stories within the scriptures are not real, but they are allegories to teach us biblical or spiritual principles that are higher principles than what we humans have. And so perhaps the largest population of Jews outside of Judea was in Egypt. And of course, Alexandria being the city that best displayed this form of culture, maybe outside of Athens. And the Jews began to be influenced this way. They had no intention to abandon their faith, but the Alexandrian Jews followed the Gentiles living around them, taking on the thoughts of Greek philosophy. And this resulted in this effort to harmonize the scriptures with the Greek thinking. Does this sound familiar to us? That we try to compromise the thinking of the world, the scientist and the philosophies of our world, while we're still hanging on to the Bible and the biblical teachings and the biblical principles. And we need to be careful with this. And the outcome was this allegorical method of interpreting scripture. That the scriptures were vulgar, misleading, they were insufficient, they were maybe taught for someone who didn't have the higher understanding, couldn't understand. So there was a hidden and a deeper meaning that must be sought. And the Jews then, by reading into the Bible, this pagan philosophy, they were able to consider themselves enlightened. And so the Hellenist Jews became more enlightened than the Orthodox Hebrews. And the Orthodox Hebrews in Palestine and in Jerusalem and in Judea and Galilee continue to hang on to the more Orthodox way of looking at things. And you can see this big melting pot. And of course, you see this throughout the beginning of the book of Acts, particularly in the first 7 chapters where they're all gathered in Jerusalem and some of the things that they're working with. Philo was one of the best known and most famous of the Jewish allegorical thinking Jews. He was the son of a wealthy Alexandrian merchant. He profited and certainly thrived within the Hellenistic thinking. Of course, you remember the great library in Alexandria was there, and of course, we'll talk about that. This is when the Septuagint was housed in this Alexandrian library, and he lived in about 20 to 50 A.D. Shortly before Jesus came. He regarded himself as a devout Jew, but while highly esteeming the writers such as Homer and Hesiod and Pindar and Plato, and he regarded Moses as the greater thinker of all, the greatest thinker of all, and the others were lesser thinkers, but he certainly played into this Greek and Hellenistic thought process and philosophies. And so it was allegorical interpretation, thoroughly subjective. If the literal sense of the scripture suggested something that the reader deemed unworthy of God, he would consider this sufficient warrant to seek a hidden allegorical meaning to it. And there are many of these Gnostics today and these allegorical thinkers today. And so the nature of the temptation for the Jews in the midst of this Hellenism is noted in the writers of this historian, Posidonius. The people of these cities are relieved, he says, by the fertility of the soil from the laborious struggle for existence. Basically, the Greeks offered a better way of life, a more convenient way of life, a richer way of life. They offered wealth and ease I'm telling you, this ought to scare us to death. Life is a continuous series of social festivities, he says. They're gymnasiums they use as baths where they anoint themselves in costly oil and myrrh. In the public eating halls, they are practically living there, filling themselves there for the better part of the day with rich foods and wine. Listen to this: much that they cannot eat, so they carry away home. They feast to the prevailing music of strings, The cities are filled from end to end with the noise of harp playing. I tell you what, ladies, this ought to scare us to death. They were people of ease. Entertainment was at their fingertips. They ate in these beautiful places that had this rich and wonderful food. In fact, they served them so much food, they had to take some of it home with them. And this became a real problem for the devout Jews because this was a temptation. It made life easy. It made life rich. It was not just a life of ease. It was a fuller life. Merchants were able to accumulate wealth, to purchase better housing and food than the life in Judea had offered. Great libraries in Alexandria and other Hellenistic centers, offering schools for their children and their youth. They could have the best educations for a nobler generation. Sculptures and art brought aesthetics to the cities and to the outlook on life, bringing excitement for the young and expression of oneself. Life was easier and better and more sophisticated and more interesting. And that's what the Hellenists offered. And that is why it was a real problem for the other Jews, for the Hasidim Jews. The Hasidim Jews, who still today are a sect of the Jews, they were the ones in Palestine. They were not removed enough from the centers of Hellenism to be untouched. They were less touched, as you could tell when in the days of the New Testament. But they, especially the most educated Jews, were enamored with the Greek way of life. Jerusalem would have its own gymnasium in the years to come. And the Greek schools and educations would appear throughout Judea. The emphasis on material things will encourage the Jews to neglect the rights and the law of God. And there would be a need for this group of Jews who would be willing to die for the faith to exist still. They would be a small remnant of the Jewish people now scattered throughout even Judea and Galilee at the time of the Maccabees, which we will talk about here in just a few years. The Hasidims would do all necessary to maintain the place of the law of the Lord in the day of moral and spiritual decay. And Hellenism has a great influence on this being an issue and on what is needed. All right, so we're going to end this class there. We went a little bit over 30 minutes, and I will see you next time for class number 8.